have some discs that we can buy?
Sure, I have them over here on the table if you want to take a look.
Hey, take a look at these. These are great, just what we're looking for.
Oh yeah, I remember those. I thought you were looking for old movies. I think I have some Kevin Hart movies in there somewhere. Are you sure you want my old class lectures?
No, this is just what we wanted.
Oh, well then. These are just some old recorded lectures from my history teacher, Mr. Pally. I think I have some more up in the attic. Let me go take a look.
Wow, a former student that's willing to talk about it. I wonder how old she is. Start working on these while we wait for her to come back down.
Is the MONROE Doctrine. It essentially is that the United States was trying to keep the European countries out of the Western Hemisphere. We would take care of the Western Hemisphere. The Europeans should stay on their own side. Really, the purpose of this was to limit the European role in the West. Europeans still had colonies in the West Indies or had just recently lost colonies there, like the Spanish. And the monarchs were trying to go back and reestablish control over this region. The Latin American countries, though, had been starting to trade with Great Britain. And remember, in a colonial system, if they were a Spanish colony, they could only trade with Spain. And the British wanted a lot of the business that came from there. They also wanted the sugar that was being grown in the West Indies. So after the colonies had broken away from Spain, Britain was asking for U.S. help to keep the Spanish out of the region. James Madison was in charge. Nationalism in the United States was at an all-time high. We had been expanding westward. We figured it was a good idea to put our claim in on the entire Western Hemisphere. In fact, some people had started arguing that it was our God-given right to expand into the West. It's a pretty weak threat. We had no ability to defend ourselves. We had almost no navy. The United States really was relying on the British to support our policy of keeping the Europeans out of the West. It's not important now, but it's going to become important later. This is John O'Sullivan. He was the newspaper editor that coined the term manifest destiny. He said that it was our manifest destiny, or our God-given right, to overspread the continent, given to us by God, allotted by providence, for the freely development of our yearly multiplying millions. In other words, we have such a big population and our people are so fertile that it's our job to go expand westward. And this is the American worldview. And this was from the colonial era, when we started off with just a little tiny little strip of land on the coast, all the way until our modern worldview. It's very ethnocentric. Other people should just move. We saw this in Oregon. We created a treaty with the British to make sure that we could get that territory out of the way. In Texas, there's cotton there. In California, there's gold. So we're going to be signing a treaty with the British so we could fight with the Mexicans over those other two territories.
Well, this is some great stuff, Caitlin. Thanks for letting us take a look at it.
You can take them if you want. I found Ride Along if you want that too.
No. This is okay. We just want to see what these are. We'll probably leave them here anyways. Just need to check out what's in it.
I remember Mr. Pally's class. He was nice. Thought he was funny, but... well, he was nice. He did try to get students to think for themselves and to question what people told them. Always ask for evidence. That kind of thing. I remember the day they took him away. It was after I graduated. I think I have the newspaper around here somewhere.
Alright, well, she's busy, so keep working.
The Texas Revolution is not the Mexican War. They actually occur about 10 years apart. Mexico had been inviting Americans to move into the Texas territory, which was then part of Mexico, around 1822. Yes, the Americans were migrants into Mexico. They wanted plantation land. They wanted to extend slavery into the southern territories. So they moved into Mexico. And slavery expanded into the West with them. You can see here's 1820 compared to 1860 on the bottom. This is the amount of cotton production in the South. What's really interesting is when I overlay the slavery, darker the color, more cotton, darker the color, the more slaves. Slavery expanded as the cotton expanded. Americans had to follow these three conditions when they moved into Mexico, though. They had to convert to Catholicism. They weren't going to. They were proud Protestants. They had to pay taxes, which they didn't really like to do, so maybe they would. And Mexico wanted them to emancipate their slaves, which was just out of the question. Without slaves, the entire plantation system falls apart because it becomes too expensive. Within 10 years, the Texas Americans are going to revolt, mostly because the Mexicans wanted them to get rid of their slaves. There's a new government in Mexico. The leader of the new government is Santa Anna, who wants the Americans to start paying their taxes, convert, and get rid of the slaves. There's a number of battles, the most famous of which is the Battle of the Alamo. Americans were decimated at the Battle of the Alamo, but this defeat turns into a victory because so many Southern Americans flooded from those southern territories into Texas that the Americans then were able to overwhelm the Mexicans. They captured the Mexican president of Santa Anna at I believe the Battle of San Jacinto. They forced him to sign 2 treaties, one of which set the borders and one of which said that the Texans were an independent state. This actually leads to a disputed zone. You can see it here in the green and yellow disputed territories. Mexico didn't recognize any independence of Texas, but if they had to recognize any, they wanted to recognize the yellow zone because that was a much smaller region, and the southern border was the Nueces River. Texas wanted it to be the Rio Grande, but the Mexicans are too weak to do anything about it. So the Texans immediately wanted to join with the United States. They were Americans, they had ties to the South, many Southerners had fought with the United States, but the United States did not want them. They did not want to annex a potentially large slave state, which would throw off the balance of power between the number of slave states and the number of free states. That is a key element here. Texas is free, it's independent, because the United States didn't want a large slave state to be part of its union yet.
Here it is. That was the newspaper from the day they took him away. They arrested him on sedition charges, but it was really because he was speaking out against the party. He used to talk about how there weren't really any good old days. People talk about that to manipulate people's nostalgia. When the party came along talking about the need to bring back America, Hallie must have questioned it. When they took him away, that was the day I went and started looking for this house. Try to be off the grid as much as possible. Anyways, can I get you some tea?
Polk was elected in 1844, 10 years after the Texas Revolution or so, and he was elected with what he felt was a mandate to annex Texas. He promised while he was running his campaign that he would try to add Texas to the United States. Therefore, he felt that once he was elected, that's what the people wanted. Although he wasn't able to get it pushed through in a regular sense. He didn't do it the way the Constitution says you're supposed to, which would have required a 2/3 majority treaty, because the balance of power meant that the free states in the North were equal to the slave states in the South, and the North didn't want to have this large slave state coming in. So he knew that treaty would have failed. So instead what he did was push through a resolution which only required a majority vote. He did try then to go buy more of Mexico. He wanted to get to California because there's a lot of gold there. So he went to Mexico, asked Mexico if he could buy the rest of the territory, and Mexico said no. So he started sending American troops into that disputed zone in purple here. And when the Mexicans naturally thought that they were being invaded, they attacked those American troops. So the American troops were killed in the disputed zone. And Polk started arguing in front of Congress, we needed to declare war with Mexico because Americans were killed on American soil. People like Abraham Lincoln called for what was referred to as the Blood Spot Amendment. Wanted to know exactly where these Americans were killed, and if it was on the disputed zone, they didn't want to go to war. But Congress sided with Polk. The Americans easily defeated Mexico. A lot of our great Civil War leaders are in the future, and then in 20 years, are going to be essentially trained during the Mexican War. Texas was affirmed and annexed, and the United States got the entire southwest corner of the modern United States in what was referred to as the Mexican Cession. After the war, Mexico sees the United States as a bully, and the United States sees Mexico as weak and uncivilized, and we can largely do whatever we want to them.
It's nice meeting people that are interested in these DVDs. I can't believe I've held on to them this long. I get the feeling that you two are looking for more than the DVDs, though. Are you... Just a second.
I guess she's not so far off the grid after all, huh?
And there's differences between the North, the South, and the West, and that's what we're going to focus on now. The westward expansion caused North-South tensions. As we expanded out west, we kept being reminded of things that were causing problems. Different geography in the North and the South and the West led to different economic specialties. They had different cultures. They had different political interests. Essentially, this is sectionalism. The culture of the North was based on its Protestant heritage. There's an emphasis on education and literacy. As many as 90% of Americans in the North, 95 actually, were literate at this time. Excuse me. The diversity in the cities, very high. There's a high immigration rate even in this era because there's industrial jobs in the cities, and education helped to assimilate those immigrants so they could become part of the society. The economics of the North were pretty straightforward. The safe harbors but fast rivers meant that while they couldn't have an internal trade network, they did have fast rivers that could power factories. And water power is going to be important all the way up until the 1860s with things like water wheels, spinning machinery. Those safe harbors meant that you could have lots of trade going on in those territories, which led to a shipping industry, which led to trade industry, which meant that there was a lot of money floating around, which meant that the people with the money could build industries and factories to make more money. And because there was all this factory work with cheap, unskilled labor, immigrants would come over, especially the Germans and the Irish early on. In the North, they wanted particular things. They wanted a high tariff to protect those infant industries. They wanted a national bank which could give out cheap loans to industrial leaders. And they wanted to protect the currency from inflation. And they wanted an internal transportation network. Partially, this is going to be Clay's American system, where you can get roads and bridges and railroads and canals into the West. The Westerners could get all those cheap raw materials, including ore, iron ore, gold, different grown products like cotton from the West into the factories in the North. Today we're going to talk about the Southern section. The economics of slavery are really the key to the Southern sectionalism. Slaves, first of all, are not free labor. There's a lot of upfront cost. This means that factory work, which was dangerous work, was unsuited to the slave system. And factories need a lot of cheap labor, so that the Northerners had what was sometimes referred to as wage slavery. You got paid a wage. You showed up to work on Monday. If you got sick and didn't show up on Tuesday, they found somebody else to replace you. You lost an arm in the machinery. They just got rid of you, and you're off on the streets. And they just pay somebody else the wage that you would have gotten on Tuesday. It doesn't work this way with a slave system. So the agricultural system of the South was much more suited to the slave system, whereas the North wanted unskilled immigrant labor. The plantation system is a little bit different. You can see that from the picture here. A lot of people working out in the fields, doing dull, monotonous, tedious work all day. Mostly the slave system is based on cash crops, cotton, rice, tobacco early on. And the plantation system often derived into the slave system. Started off as indentured service, turned into the slave system before the American Revolution. The deep rivers also meant that there were few roads that needed to be built. The trade ships could come right up to the plantation. You didn't have to have little town hubs as commercial centers. So there's few towns, there's few roads, there's large self-sufficient plantations. There's no public education because there's no central town for students to walk to. The wealthy would hire tutors. The poor didn't need education. They were busy scratching a living out of the soil. Only about 25% of the population in the South owned slaves. The other 75% didn't. And teaching African Americans was made illegal. In fact, by the Civil War, about 10% of the African Americans will be literate. So that's a big difference. There were no immigrants in the South, largely because there was not many towns and there not many factories, so there really wasn't any need for it. And there's a lot less diversity in the South. There's African Americans and there's the white population, not much else. Which means that African Americans had a really deep impact on the Southern culture, but not so much in the North. The Southern political issues were that they opposed the protective tariff, which means they opposed the tariff because they didn't have any factories, but also the tariff would have increased the price of the manufactured goods that they needed to buy. Also, if you go back and remember the nullification crisis, this was a Southern issue. They also opposed the National Bank because they felt that the National Bank was giving too much power to wealthy Northerners. They also felt that state banks could do the job just as well and it'd be more constitutional. Those Southern issues, they opposed the internal transportation improvements. They felt that the internal improvements were a conspiracy by the North and the West to team up against the South, that they didn't need highways. They wanted cheap land out west, which would have allowed the expansion of more cotton, which would allow the expansion of slavery. And remember that that's what's going on in Texas.
That's weird. That was the mayor's office. They said they heard I have some interesting items that they want to buy. Didn't you guys place the ad for...
Oh, Caitlin, I would love that cup of tea now. Do you mind? Okay, 10. We need to leave the DVDs and try to ease the mayor's concern. If they already called, somebody's already on the way. We have maybe 20, maybe 30 minutes. Work fast. I'm going to go look for a place to hide.
To look at the western section. When people moved out west, if they were from the north, they typically were free soilers, and when moving from the south, they typically had their beliefs in slavery with them. They tended to be rugged individuals in the west, and they were in search of fertile farmland to grow staple crops, mostly if you're from the north, and in the south, they were looking for cash crops, especially cotton. And there's also a number of large mineral deposits out west. In Nevada, there's a lot of silver. In California, there's a lot of gold. But for the most part, the West is going to be largely agricultural. Remember Manifest Destiny, and the Western political interests were to get as many internal improvements as possible. In other words, they wanted to have a lot of roads, canals, bridges, railroads later, connecting them to the northern territories. They also wanted a lot of cheap land, mostly government land, which is a little ironic when they want to see themselves as rugged individuals. They also supported a number of northern issues, like the tariff, simply because they wanted to get the northerners on their side when it came to political discussions. And they really distrusted the national bank, well, even though that was a northern issue, because they liked unregulated money, because unregulated money tends to increase inflation, which makes it easier to pay off their mortgages and pay their taxes. The South distrusted that Northwest alliance. They felt threatened by it. The fear was that if the North and the West acted together, then there would be more free soil states than there would be slavery states, which eventually might lead to the abolition of slavery, and that would ruin the entire way of life for the South. Clay's American system is what really was the focus of the Southern vehemence against the West. The alliance system was based on internal improvements, the most specific of which was the Erie Canal, which tied New York City to the Great Lakes. And then from the Great Lakes, they could float down the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico. Essentially, it ties the entire American continent into the Atlantic Ocean trade. The Clay's American system also included railroads, more canals, roads to connect the north and the south. Most of the improvements are being done in the northern sections, and that only increased the tension.
Ted, quick, come here. I found a mudroom in the back. It's blocked from the front door view and has a quick escape route if we need it. I'm pretty sure the mayor and his aides don't know that we're here. If they did, they wouldn't have called first. They would have just shown up. I hope we can just hide and wait this out. Maybe Caitlin can talk them down, convince them she has some old movies or something. Anyways, keep working. We'll get out of this.
Remember, the sectional differences occurred largely because of social and cultural differences. You're going to hear the term antebellum being thrown around during this time period. That simply means before the war, and in this case, that means before the Civil War. There are a number of economic factors that drove the difference between the two sections. The North was based heavily on industry, and the South based on cash crops and plantations, which by definition means slavery. Regionalism was essentially this pride that transformed into sectionalism. You were proud of your region, and that turned into sectionalism. Westward expansion only exacerbated these tensions, which means made them worse. Economic policies like the tariff and Clay's American system were all problems, and really the issue all centered around the extension of slavery. Just a reminder about the North, they were heavily affected by their Puritan upbringing and their Protestant religion. There was towns, churches, town meetings. Education was important so that you could have literacy for the Bible. The North also had Quakers, which were incredibly tolerant of other religions, while the Puritans were not. And the Quakers are where you get the first abolitionists. They believed that everyone had an inner light and that it was morally abhorrent to own another person. Economically, the North was very diverse, had a lot of cities. The industries of the North encouraged a lot of immigrants to work in cheap labor. Interestingly enough, the education that was present in the North allowed those immigrants to assimilate or join in with the current culture and to adapt to the American lifestyle. And there was relatively few slaves in the North because starting right after the Declaration of Independence, many northern states actually implemented a policy of gradual emancipation. This meant that there was little cultural impact of African American life in the North. There were free African Americans in the North, but as you remember from the Jacksonian discussion, they were essentially second-class citizens that had been disenfranchised or had lost the right to vote. There were a number of political issues that we saw in 2.3, including the North favored tariffs and wanted a strong national bank. In the South, the regionalism was dominated by the planter elites. While most families didn't actually own slaves, about 75% did not, and they lived on small family farms, everyone aspired to be of the planter class. South had large, deep, navigable rivers like the Santee and the Cooper, and that meant that the boat, like you see in this picture here, could just go right up to the plantation and deliver any goods and collect any cash crops that needed to be sold at the market. There's very little in the way of public education because there's no town. The wealthy had tutors, the poor were too busy to go to school, and the slaves, literacy was outlawed. That doesn't mean that they didn't necessarily learn to read. About 10% of slaves were literate during emancipation. There are few cities, few immigrants, which meant little diversity in the South. There are a lot of influences of African Americans in the South. Think of the Gullah Geechee here in South Carolina. And this is where the slave density was by 1850. The darker the color, the more slaves in the area.
Miss Dudley, hi. We hear you might have some stuff that we'd be interested in.
I can't think of anything. I don't know what you'd be interested in.
Miss Dudley, please. We know that you have something.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't have anything.
All right, I've heard enough. Boys, take her away.
Wait, no, don't take me! I don't know what you're talking about!
This is so frustrating. She would have just listened. All right, let's take a look around and see what we can find.
We need to go. Run to the car, quick.
In the West, the settlers brought their culture with them. Again, this is all review. The Northwest had northern values, typically free soil, and in the South, they had southern values, typically based on planter culture and wanted the extension of slavery. And in the West, manifest destiny values ruled. A strong individualism streak, wanted cheap land, internal transportation improvements like roads, canals, and bridges, and then later railroads, and unregulated banking to increase inflation and have easier mortgage payments.
That was close. Caitlin wasn't a threat. She just wanted to live her quiet life in the woods. She had made it through so much to make it through the takeover and stay true to herself. She had to take such precautions. This is our fault. Well, we got out without being spotted, so we should be fine getting back to the bunker. Keep working on those DVDs until we get back. We cannot waste her sacrifice.
Remember that during this, prior to the Civil War, African Americans had been emancipated early. Slavery was prohibited during the Northwest Ordinance, which occurred right after the American Revolution. So during the antebellum period, we can see that the different regions are differentiating. But it's important to remember that free does not mean equal. In the North, many of the African Americans were second-class citizens, even if they were free African Americans. This means they were disenfranchised during the age of universal white male suffrage. They didn't have the right to vote, even though they were citizens. Often, de facto segregation was practiced, which means while they were not segregated by law, in practice, that's what happened. African Americans tend to stay together, whites stay together, and so forth. There was a lot of workplace discrimination in the North. There was a policy of last hired, first fired.
So I've been thinking, and something's bothering me. How did Cromwell know to check out Caitlin's house? We put the ad in the newspaper. She called us. I didn't mention anything to anyone, and no one in the bunker knew. So that leaves a couple of bad options. Either they knew about her, which is unlikely, or they knew about me and are tapping my line, and I didn't want to think about that. Why didn't they take me out? There's got to be an explanation. What is that? Did you keep the campaign button? They must have been tracking it. Thank goodness we don't park at the bunker. Thank goodness you didn't take it to the bunker. It's not your fault. But that means Caitlin is our fault. Quick, throw that out the window. Oh, no. That's a dust trail behind us. And it's coming from Caitlin's house, and it's coming fast. Alright, I'm sure Red has an escape set up for us. Keep working. We'll upload your data when we get back to civilization and Wi-Fi. You know, just in case.
The vast majority of African Americans did live in the South, and the vast majority of those were slaves. The Upper South had few slaves. The Deep South had many slaves. It's important to recognize that there's a difference between the different types of slavery. There's a difference between rice versus cotton plantations. The treatment of slaves depended on the master. But even a kind master saw slaves as property, and they broke their property to be manageable. They didn't treat them as humans. They were an economic transaction. So while the physical punishment may not have been there, if you see them as a simple investment, then when a child is born, that is a profit, and you can make a profit off that by breaking up families, and they often did. That was also another punishment to the African Americans, was their families would be broken up occasionally if, as a punishment to a particularly obstinate slave. Southern free African Americans were present, and they lived mostly in the cities. Typically, there were artisans that had more opportunities than they would have in the North because their skills were more in demand, because there's not many people, even whites, that had those skills in the South. But they also were second-class citizens.
Oh, finally some cell coverage. Red. Yeah, we got trouble. We're about 10, 15 miles out. I think option 2 is going to have to be worked. I can get up to about 45 on these dirt roads before it's a problem. You got us on trackers? Alright, feed me the turns and the speeds. 10. We have a great train escape set up. I'll fill you in about 5-10 minutes. Get what you can done.
The Great Awakening occurs around a little bit after 1800. This is a religious movement that inspired a number of different reform efforts. One, education, prison reform, and abolitionism, which is the one that we're most concerned with. Abolition is different than the Free Soil movement. Free Soilers were typically whites that did not want to have to compete with slave labor. Doesn't mean they were scared of the African Americans. They didn't want the plantation owners to move in, buy up all the land, and then the white Northerners wouldn't have any land to buy. They just didn't want slaves near them. Abolitionists, on the other hand, saw slavery as a moral evil, and they wanted to get rid of slavery altogether. So who were the abolitionists? Well, you had the Quakers, who believed that all men had an inner light and that you could not own another one of God's people. There were African Americans like Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman. And then there were white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, the Grimke sisters, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and John Brown.
Hey, Red, what does that distance between us and Cromwell look like?
I took the lead.
It's getting a bit too tight.
Somebody's heart.
Alright, if you think we're going to make it, I trust you. Hey, Red, did you know anything about the mayor's interest in Caitlin's place? Yeah, I didn't either. Just checking. I think they're bugging campaign buttons now. Might want to start sweeping the vehicles. Alright, 10, so here's the plan. We're going to do an old-fashioned train stunt. We're going to jump in front of the train just before it passes through. That should cut us off from the mayor's pursuit. They're catching up, but they're not going to be able to get to us first. The timing needs to be just right, but as soon as we hit the other side, you're going to need to hit that little button in the glove box. That's going to trigger the car's detonator. We got about 10 seconds, so always be prepared, right? I love this car. But no use in getting sentimental now. Make sure you have your laptop and get out. We only got 10 seconds between you hitting that button and the big boom. If we time it just right, it should look like the train clipped us and the tank blew up. Keep working. We have a little bit of time before we get to that crossing.
There was not a lot of fear in the South. The threat of abolition caused a lot of Southern defensiveness. First of all, the sheer number of slaves in the Deep South caused a mortal terror. If all the slaves turned on their masters, they could simply swamp the masters and kill them and their families. Think of the Nat Turner rebellion on a grand scale. Also, the value of the slaves was worth more than all other American industries combined. If you took that capital away from the Southern plantation owners, they would be destitute. So to lose their slaves would literally mean the loss of all of their wealth, which would only cause damage further into the South. By the way, the cotton crop was increasing throughout the entire antebellum period. Don't believe it when people say, well, slavery would have withered away because in 1860, so the soil was drying up and the boll weevil and all that. That's nonsense. The 1860s had the largest cotton crop that the United States had ever had. The Southerners did try to justify their peculiar institution, which is a euphemism that they used for slavery, by saying that their version of slavery, which is called chattel slavery, was better than the northern version, which was called wage slavery. See, in the South, they said that they took care of their slaves, that because it's an economic situation, they needed to have good, strong, healthy slaves. So they fed them well and gave them time off, and they took care of them in their old age and all that. Whereas in the North, those were wage slaves, and they showed up every day, whether they were sick or healthy, and they didn't. If they didn't show up to work, they were fired and replaced. There was no social security benefit. They also believed in paternalism, that the children were merely childlike, that they needed the slave master to act as a parent. They believed that it was a positive good for the slaves because they were brought from Africa and they were Christianized, and without slavery they wouldn't have found the value of Christ. They believed that they were taking care of them in their young age and then their old age. The North is not absolved from this sin, by the way. Abolitionists were a small minority in the North, and even the abolitionists didn't necessarily want equality. This is not to say that it is justified for the South to hold the beliefs. Northern businesses did benefit from the Southern cotton industry as well.
Hey, 10, you almost ready? You should be able to finish that up just before we hit the crossing. Red's telling me the coast is clear in the front. Mayor's car is staying steady behind us. Man, I wish we would have had more time at that cabin. But there's a ton of stuff she didn't even know about. If she had those discs laying around, she's probably a hoarder. Probably had more. Might have even had some old primary source material. Maybe even a history book or two. See, during the takeover, APOC rounded up what it could, but she seemed to get out pretty quickly, lived on her own. Man, it's too bad the Jacks are probably combing through her stuff right now. And they'll put a surveillance around the cabin so we can't even risk getting back there without getting caught. Man, poor Caitlin. I hope she makes it out alright. Plays dumb or something. Keep an eye out for her, but the way that went down, I'll be surprised if she just isn't disappeared. Let's remember her sacrifice and not waste that data you have there. Finish up. We're almost at the crossing.
Abolitionism did also help create the women's rights movement, although not intentionally. Some abolitionists didn't want women to have any leadership positions within the abolitionist movement. So the women broke off to fight for women's rights. They decided to try to get their rights before they would help the African American men get their rights. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton delivered the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments all the way back in 1846. And you can read the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments here. Essentially what she says is that men are the problems for women and that they act tyrannically over her, bases a lot of her language off the Declaration of Independence.
Hey, you better be done. Pack it up. Grab the discs. Get ready to jump. Well, that was an interesting day. Check this out. Turns out the party leadership wasn't all that happy with Cromwell's inability to take care of our little nuisance. They say the corruption charges, but that's a bunch of baloney. APOC is one big corruption. No, what that headline means is that they weren't too happy with him. Live by the sword, die by the sword, I guess. He couldn't get to us, so they got to him. I'll bet you that he'll get the max sentence in a very quick and very public trial. Then, I wouldn't be too surprised if he runs into some problems in prison and we read about him next in the obituaries. At least we knew what we were up against with Cromwell, though. Charismatic, not too bright thug. We'll have to be on our toes for his replacement. From what I'm hearing, the governor himself might make a little visit out here to clean things up before they name a replacement. I guess we'll see soon enough, so let's get some rest. Good work out there today.
of ourselves. We see their heads hung low. We were